like to call subcommittee to order. This morning, the subcommittee will mark up two bills. First, we'll consider H.R. 1017, the Chiropractic Care Availability to All Veterans Act, which would require VA to provide chiropractic care and services to veterans at all VA medical centers. This bill helps to make chiropractic care more accessible to our veterans, especially those who serve in Iraq and Afghanistan, as more than half of returning veterans from OEF, OIF continues to report ailments such as back pain and disabling joint and back disorder as a top health problem. Next, we'll consider H.R. 5145, Assuring Quality Care for Our Veterans Act. This bill would help VA with the retention efforts by not using by not only increasing the amount of continuing education reimbursement, but also expanding this benefit beyond doctors and dentists to help healthcare professionals at the VA. I'd like to turn to Ranking Member Brown for any statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Musculoskeletal ailment are one of the top concerns for our veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. In an effort to ease those concerns, I am proud to support H.R. 1017, the Chiropractic Care Available to All Veterans Act, which would ensure that every VA medical center has a chiropractor on staff by 2013. Also want to thank my good friend and colleague, Mr. Jerry Moran from Kansas, for his long-time effort to ensure the provisions of chiropractic care within the VA. It was Mr. Moran who spearheaded the original legislature from 2003 that gave VA the authority to employ chiropractors. I have no further comments to you back.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Before I get started, I'd ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks. Hearing no objections, so ordered. I now call up H.R. 1017 for consideration and ask unanimous consent that H.R. 1017 be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there objections? Hearing none, so ordered. H.R. 1017 would require VA to offer chiropractic care and services to veterans at all VA medical centers. Would any member like to make comments on this bill?
Yes, sir.
Chair recognizes Mr. Rodriguez.
Let me just thank you very much on this piece of legislation, because I know that we've talked back and forth. So I want to also congratulate Mr. Morano on that also, because there's no doubt that we do have a good number of soldiers coming back that have a tremendous need in that area. So I just want to take this opportunity to congratulate you in bringing this piece of legislation forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Hearing none, the bill is now open for an amendment. Are there any amendments to the bill? I actually do have an amendment to H.R. 1017, which has been made available to all of you in advance of the markup. I'd ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read. Hearing no objection, so ordered. This amendment simply updates the deadline for offering chiropractic care at 75 medical centers by December 31st, 2011, and to all VA medical centers by December 31st, 2013. Are there any questions on the amendment? Hearing none. Any further discussion? Hearing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the bill? Hearing none, the question is on adopting H.R. 1017 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The ayes have it. H.R. 1017 as amendment is agreed to. I now recognize Mr. Brown for a motion to favorably report H.R. 1017 as amended to the full committee.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 1017 as amended be reported favorable to the full committee.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The ayes have it. H.R. 1017 is reported to the full committee as amended. I now call up H.R. 5145 for consideration and ask unanimous consent that H.R. 5145 be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there objection? Hearing none, so ordered. H.R. 5145 would increase the amount of reimbursement for continuing education and would expand the program beyond doctors and dentists to other healthcare professionals at the VA. Would any member like to make a comment on this bill? Chair recognizes Mr. McNerney.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your continued leadership on healthcare issues facing our nation's veterans, and I appreciate you holding this markup today. Our committee has made significant bipartisan strides to improve the quality of health care that veterans receive at VA facilities, but more work clearly remains. One area that continues to merit our attention is to ensure that VA has enough medical professionals available to meet the needs of our veterans. A closely connected goal is providing VA doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals with financial resources that will enable them to continue receiving medical education. Making sure the VA professionals have the most up-to-date medical information is critical for retention efforts and for guaranteeing the quality of health care delivered to veterans across the country. With a new generation of veterans returning home from wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it is important as ever that the VA medical community has up-to-date training on the treatment of traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, and other conditions. In 1991, legislation was enacted to allow physicians and dentists to be reimbursed by the VA for continued professional education. That reimbursement was and still is $1,000. It's been 19 years since the VA medical professionals have seen an increase in that compensation amount. For all these reasons, I introduced H.R. 5145, the Assuring Quality Care for Veterans Act. This legislation raises reimbursement amounts to $1,600, matching the rate of inflation. In addition, H.R. 5145 expands the VA's authority to offer continuing professional education reimbursements, allowing all health professionals employed by the VA to qualify. As a result, optometrists, nurses, chiropractors, and other medical experts will be eligible to receive fair compensation for continuing their medical education. This bill is supported by the American Legion, Paralyzed Veterans of America, and the Veterans of Foreign Wars. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense, bipartisan legislation, and I would like to thank the Chairman and Chairman Filner for their committee staff for their efforts on this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. McNerney, and thank you for all your efforts to make sure that veterans get the care that they need. Any other comments? Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is a VA motto to provide the best care anywhere. But in order to do that, we must employ the best health care providers anywhere. Ensuring VA doctors and nurses are given the opportunity to continually hone their skills is an important endeavor, and I support H.R. 5145 to improve continuing professional education reimbursement and expand VA's authority to offer such reimbursement. Thanks, I yield back.
Thank you. Any other comments? If not, the bill is now open for amendment. Are there any amendments to the bill? The question is now on adopting H.R. 5145. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The ayes have it. H.R. 5145 is agreed to. I now recognize Mr. Brown for a motion to favorably report H.R. 5145 to the full committee.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 5145 be reported favorably to the full committee.
The question's on the motion. Is there a second? Seconded. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5145 is favorably reported to the full committee. Without objection, the committee staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to all the bills forward to the full committee today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I want to thank everyone for participating in the subcommittee markup. Call the subcommittee markup to a close. I want to thank staff as well for all your hard work on both sides of the aisle for working on both these bills that we voted out today, and look forward to the full committee as we move forward.
States
I'd like to ask the committee to come to order, and I want to thank everyone for being here today. And I'd ask the first panel and only panel to come forward. We have Pat Vandenberg from the VA, who is accompanied by Gita Appel. I want to thank you both for coming today. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the VA's implementation of the Enhanced Contract Care Pilot Program for rural veterans. This pilot program was authorized in the 110th Congress and has an effective date of 120 days after October 10th of 2008. However, the pilot program remains unavailable to eligible veterans. I want to thank Congressman Moran for introducing this legislation back in the 110th and his continued support to make sure that veterans, regardless of where they live, get the access to health care that they need. We now have about 40% or nearly 3 million veterans who use the VA healthcare system live in rural areas, which includes over 100,000 veterans who reside in highly rural areas. This trend is likely to continue since a large number of our men and women serving our country in Iraq and Afghanistan are recruited from our rural communities. I recognize and appreciate the VA's effort in addressing the health care needs of our rural veterans who are more likely to be in poor health than those in urban areas. However, more work remains in this area as our rural veterans face unique challenges that are both extensive and complex. The Enhanced Contract Pilot Program is a potential tool for expanding access to health care for our rural veterans in areas where VA is unable to provide care. I would like to learn more about the steps that the VA has taken to implement an enhanced contract care pilot program. I also would like to fully understand any potential barriers that are hindering the implementation of this important pilot program. And I look forward to hearing the testimonies of our witness today. I would now like to recognize Mr. Brown for any opening statements that he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As always, I appreciate your leadership and thank you for holding this hearing today to review the status of VA's implementation of the Enhanced Contract Care Pilot Program, enacted into law in the 110th Congress as Section 403 of Public Law 110-387. Also want to commend my good friend and colleague from Kansas, Jerry Moran, for his work and continued commitment to serving rural veterans. Jerry was the sponsor of the Rural Veterans Access to Care Act, which led to the establishment of this 3-year demonstration project to allow highly rural veterans to receive covered services through non-VA providers. Of the almost 8 million veterans enrolled in the VA health care system, approximately 3 million reside in rural areas. Often these veterans face incredible difficulties in accessing VA health care. Many must find transportation and traverse hours across rough terrain to reach the nearest VA hospital. If a round trip is not possible in one day because of distance, the rural veteran and their family may be compelled to stay overnight. These difficulties can make even routine medical appointments an expensive and lengthy chore and discourage rural veterans from using the health benefits to which their service entitled them. Helping to ease that burden and ensure that even those veterans who chose to make their homes in the most rural of areas have access to high-quality care they deserve is the pride of all of us on this subcommittee. And this pilot is very important to determine ways to best serve our veterans residing in highly rural areas. As more and more veterans return to their rural homes from Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom, and rural veterans from earlier wars continue to require care, we must continually evaluate our actions and determine what more can be done to provide timely and appropriate access to medical care. In that vein, I am eager to hear from the VA this morning on what the department is doing to implement the law and what additional steps should be taken to ensure success. I thank you for coming today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Any other committee members would have an opening statement? Hearing none, once again, I want to thank Pat Vandenberg for coming here. Pat, as I mentioned earlier, is the Assistant, Deputy Undersecretary for Health, for Policy and Planning, and is also Acting Director of the Office of Rural Health, and appreciate your willingness to take on dual responsibilities, and it's my understanding that we're closer to having a full-time Director of the Office of Rural Health, and look forward for that individual coming on board so we can have a real attention paid to rural health issues. So without any further ado, Mrs. Vandenberg.
For the invitation to meet with you today and describe the VA's progress in implementing Section 403 of Public Law 110-387. Joining me today is Gita Uppel, the Director of Policy Analysis, who has been the lead on the implementation of this pilot project. Section 403, as you well know, requires VA to conduct pilot programs to provide non-VA healthcare services through contractual arrangements to eligible veterans. The statute directs that the pilot programs be conducted in at least 5 VISNs. VA has determined that VISNs 1, 6, 15, 18, and 19 meet the statute's requirements. The statute defines a veteran to be highly rural on driving distance to the nearest VA healthcare facility. Veterans are also considered highly rural and eligible to participate in this pilot if they experience hardship or other difficulties in travel. Details of what constitutes hardship are not specified in the law, so VA is formulating regulations to define this term with sufficient clarity to provide practical standards. Immediately after the law was enacted, VA established a cross-functional multidisciplinary work group with a wide range of representatives from various VA program offices as well as VISN representatives to identify issues and develop an implementation plan. VA soon recognized that the pilot program could not be commenced in the 120 days of the law's enactment as required. And in March 2009, VA officials briefed subcommittee staff on these implementation issues. The first challenge that VA shared with Congress was the statute's definition of highly rural. The statute using driving distances to define a highly rural veteran, whereas VA uses Census Bureau definition and defines a highly rural veteran as a veteran who resides in a county with fewer than 7 civilians per square mile. VA has developed our data systems based on the Census Bureau definition and uses these systems to identify highly rural veterans. To implement the law, we knew that we would need to reconfigure our data systems to identify travel distances for each enrolled veteran for multiple VA facilities, conduct analysis to identify eligibility according to the statute's definition, and develop enrollment and utilization projections for the pilot program using the definitions in the law. VA completed this reconfiguration and analysis in October 2009. The second challenge involved the term hardship, which VA needs to define through regulations. This process involves many steps, as you well know, including public review and comment, and can take up to 24 months to complete. VA notes that Section 308 of S. 1963, which was recently enacted by Congress, would amend that requirement regarding hardship exception and the mileage standard. We believe these changes will facilitate faster implementation of the program, and we're very grateful to the committee for including these technical amendments in the Caregiver and Veterans Omnibus Health Services Act of 2010. While progress has been slower than you expected and than we would have liked, VA has made notable strides in implementing this law, and the goal is to have the pilot program operational in the latter part of 2010 or early 2011. Specifically, VA has taken the following actions. We've developed a comprehensive implementation plan which contains the work group's recommendations on implementing the various implications of the pilot program. We've analyzed the driving distances for each enrollee to identify eligible veterans using the drive distance criteria and reconfigured our data systems, and now we'll make whatever accommodation is necessary in light of the technical change. We've provided eligible enrollee distribution maps to each of the participating VISNs to aid them in their planning for potential sites. We've developed an internal request for proposal and disseminated that to the 5 VISNs for proposals on potential pilot sites. We've developed the application form, which the veterans participating in this program will use. We formulated the definition of hardship, but in light of the technical changes, we may not have to use that. We've also taken extensive action to leverage the insights from Project HERO, the healthcare effectiveness through resource optimization pilot, and adapted those insights for this pilot project. VA will assemble an evaluation team of subject matter experts to review the proposals that are submitted by the 5 VISNs. This team will then recommend the specific locations for approval by the Undersecretary for Health. We anticipate this process will be complete this summer. After sites have been selected, VA will begin the acquisition process. Since this process depends to some degree on the willingness of non-VA providers to participate, we are not able to stipulate exactly when the pilot can commence. However, we are using all of the resources and insights gained through Project HERO and contracting specialists to expedite the process. This would allow us to begin the pilot, as I said a minute ago, in the latter part of this year or early 2011. So we thank you today for the opportunity to come before you to discuss progress. We believe that this pilot will give us a further opportunity to explore innovative approaches to providing health care for veterans in remote areas, and we are eager to proceed with the implementation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vandenberg. I have several questions. However, I'll recognize Ranking Member Brown first to begin with his questions. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Have you identified providers to participate in the pilot, and if not, why not? And are you expecting challenges regarding the willingness of non-VA providers to participate in the pilot program?
Mr. Brown, we haven't identified providers at this point. We are focused at this stage on identifying the sites that the VISNs believe will be the appropriate sites, and then the next step in the process would be to announce the opportunity to serve these veterans, at which point the provider community will be engaged. We don't have any specific understanding at this point that we will not have a welcome reception in the provider community. However, we do know in other instances in rural health service delivery that not every community has an adequate number of providers who are interested in working with VA. So we don't see any absolute impediments at this point in time.
And the, I guess, just the structure of providing the provider, how would you classify the reimbursement for those providers? Would it be based on Medicare or Medicaid reimbursement? How would you determine that?
Sir, I'll have to take that question for the record, and I would just observe that there are a number of discussions underway right now regarding reimbursement in various contracting activities that we pursue for various components of VA healthcare. And so this is an area of interest and concern to some stakeholders. So we'll provide the technical response to your question for the record, but I am sensitive to the fact that the provider community does have concerns about the level of reimbursement that they are able to achieve in VA contracting in some communities.
And I guess there's a reason I asked the question, because I think in order to attract the proper providers, you're going to have, I guess, some initiative to encourage them to participate. I know in South Carolina we have a lot of rural health care centers already established, and I don't know whether part of your plan was to try to interact with some of those, rural health care centers.
Our goal is to secure the services of qualified providers that will optimize the performance of this pilot. And so at this point, we don't have any parameters set that would preclude any willing provider from participating in the contracting process.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Perriello? Well, I should say, Mr. Rodriguez, have any questions? Or?
Let me ask you, I think in terms of, I know I represent probably one of the largest districts in the country. I have, it stretches 650 miles straight and then about 800 miles through the border. And in the middle of there, it's cut into two districts. And I know that probably has some, and I have people from my area, from Texas, that have to go all the way to Albuquerque, New Mexico for services. And I know that there's some expansions that are looking at El Paso, which is a lot closer. It's still 200 to 300 miles away. In that area, I know that we've been, I think that there was a little contract out there in one of the communities, but and it hasn't gone well in terms of the payment problems, that they were taking 2 3 months to pay, that kind of problems. Have we looked at that in terms of what we've done in the past and how we can improve on that? Because I know that providers were waiting 3 months before they got reimbursed and those kind of things.
Yes, sir, I have. And I would also observe that there is a representative on the Veterans Rural Health Advisory Committee that the Secretary has established from Texas. And she's made us very aware of some of the practical implications of contracting and timely payment of contractors. In the instance that you're citing, I think we have attempted to rectify that situation in terms of timely payment. We had a change in the provider group and needed to establish that new relationship and smooth out the payment mechanisms. But I am familiar with at least one circumstance, and I'd be happy to entertain the particulars of the circumstance that you're referencing and follow up on that.
And the other question I would ask, in terms of, as we look in terms of providing those kind of services to our veterans, and have we looked in terms of how comprehensive or what would be the type, for example, the first 4 or 5 type of services that we would provide for veterans?
Our initial emphasis in our conversations with the VISNs has been around primary care services, since that is the cornerstone of the VA's model of care. And we're also going to be looking out beyond primary services to what are the characteristic patterns of need among that population for specialty, subspecialty services. So we will look at the range of service that the veteran needs.
And if I could follow up with a question, I know that we, ironically enough, we wanted excess, but there are some that are willing to travel all the way to, to San Antonio, for example, in 150 miles or 200 miles, and they are indicating in that particular situation that they're required to go to that local clinic when they've had a relationship. Even though it's 150 miles away, that they would prefer to do that. Are we requiring them to go to that local facility?
I'd have to take that question for the record in terms of the specifics of what the practice has been in that VISN and in that community. But let me just make an observation that I think is germane to this discussion. The major thrust in the Department of Veterans Affairs, Veterans Health Administration strategy at this time is for us to become more veteran-centric. And in our healthcare delivery, we have launched a major initiative referred to as the Patient-Centered Medical Home. In that model, we are committed to asking the veteran their preference and attempting to honor that preference more systematically. So in an instance where there are options, rather than instructing the veteran that they absolutely have to go one place or another place, working with that veteran to understand what best suits their health care needs and their preferences to the best of our ability. So there may be two veterans, one preferring to receive care in that civic community, and a second veteran, for whatever reason, preferring to travel to a VA facility, a VA provider, a CBOC, or a VA medical center. So I think our overall effort at this point in time is to, in every way possible, attempt to be more veteran-centric. And hopefully, when it comes to our rural and highly rural veterans, this new approach to our basic model of care will go a long way to better meeting their needs, because we will be more attuned to what works for them.
And I do want to thank you also, because it's been really good, at least the last two, and I haven't heard the beauty of it. I haven't heard any more complaints, except that more veterans are actually participating and showing up.
Well, we attempted, I'm aware of one instance where I know that my office intervened and basically pointed out to the VISN that we would have to do a better job.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Moran?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you for holding this hearing, and Ms. Vandenberg, thank you for being here. I generally have a sense that the VA has worked well and pursued this issue, so I'm very appreciative of that. You've kept me and my staff informed, and so I'm grateful for that. Your testimony raises a significant concern for me, however. This started out as legislation that would affect the entire country, and if you lived a certain number of miles from a provider, you would then be eligible for VA care provided with a local provider. It was narrowed to be a certain number of VISNs as a pilot or demonstration project. But your testimony suggests to me that we're now narrowing it even further, and that you're going to do a particular community within that VISN. And that's troublesome to me, because we've gone from a broad scope, taking care of a large number of veterans, to I was convinced that we ought to see how this works. But the CBO score, as we analyzed this, as the VA talked about its cost, to me it was never suggested that we were not going to provide the same opportunity for community-based service for every veteran who lived that number of miles, now that number of minutes, from a provider, from a VA provider. Am I understanding the testimony correctly, that now we're just going to select certain communities within the VISN and make that the pilot program?
We have asked the VISNs to identify multiple sites as focal points within their VISN for potentially standing up this pilot project. At this point in time, that is the direction that we're moving in. We understood the wording in the law when it said the secretary will select areas, sites, that was permissible, that was feasible in the pilot structure. So we are here obviously today to gain further insight from the committee as to your expectations.
Well, that certainly would be different than my expectations, and Mr. Michaud and others may have an opinion, but I'd be very critical of the concept that we're going to narrow the opportunities for veterans even further. So if you're a veteran that lives the number of minutes from a provider, you may or may not qualify, depending upon whether the VISN director decided that your community is one that now qualifies. What I envision and what I hope that the VA would pursue is that if you meet the definition of highly rural and you're in that pilot demonstration VISN, you qualify. And in fact, the VA has the obligation of providing a provider, finding a provider for you to meet your health care needs. So I'd welcome additional dialogue. Maybe other members of the committee have an opinion in regard to the intention. But as I recall, the CBO budget estimation did not narrow it one more step, as it suggests that you suggest may occur. So my red flag is up.
Thank you for the clarification, sir.
You're very welcome. The legislation that the President's now expected to sign, do you have a sense which redefines miles to minutes and the definition of help me, the definition of
hardship.
Thank you, hardship. Will it speed up the implementation date? Do you have a sense that now we're moving ahead 6 months more quickly, or?
It certainly will facilitate us not being impeded by the regulatory process. And so we believe that we are on a path at this point, having issued the guidance to the field and asking them to identify sites. We may have to amend that per the conversation we are having. But we don't see any firm impediment, except for the fact that I referenced earlier. We have no way of knowing when this goes out to the provider community what the level of receptivity would be. So I'd say that the rate of progress going forward will be a function of the contracting mechanism and the receptivity in the provider community to work with us.
I think that receptivity will in part depend upon the reimbursement rate that you conclude is appropriate. And my understanding is that the VA's current fee-based is fee-based, and you cover the entire cost of care. You provide health care for veterans with local providers today.
Yes, sir.
And I think you cover the entire cost of doing so. That, I assume, it would be the most desirable role model for the veteran and for the healthcare provider in getting this implemented and widespread use. So I'm hoping that you take you follow the same practice that you've been following in the past of how you reimburse hometown providers today. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but I would welcome your input or the staff input on this issue of a pilot within a pilot. I'm fearful that we're narrowing the scope, and the number of veterans that we wanted to take care of across the country was already narrowed to a certain number of veterans, to a certain number of VISNs, and we need to make sure, in my opinion, that it's not narrowed further, that you have to live in a particular community within that VISN in order to access this health care. I thank the chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moran, and you're absolutely correct. The whole intent was to have the VISN, the whole VISN, not a pilot within that VISN, and I believe we actually got a CBO score predicated on the full VISN, not on pilots within that VISN, and you're 100% correct. It is the intent of the legislation was for the full VISN, and that is a concern. This is not the first time we've seen the same thing happen. We actually saw it back in legislation that was passed in 2006 relating to state veterans nursing homes, where it required the VA to provide full cost of health care for veterans. And through the rulemaking process, the VA narrowed that down to what full cost meant for the VA. And we're trying to correct that issue currently. So, but you're 100% correct, Mr. Moran. It was for the full VISN.
Mr. Chairman, excuse me, and I would point that, to my knowledge, this is the first time I've heard, as we've had briefings from the VA on this topic, this is the first time I've seen the narrowing of the narrowing. And so I appreciate the chairman's comment.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a further comment?
Yes.
We obviously will respond to the feedback that we're receiving today. But just to go back to the question of what further challenge or impediment might we experience, I would just like to observe that when attempting to put a provider in place for highly rural veterans who will no doubt be dispersed in a VISN, we will likely experience a situation of multiple contracting relationships. And so that could potentially extend the timely implementation for coverage in an entire VISN. So I'm just wanting to acknowledge that I hear you. I further appreciate the intent, and just practically speaking, obviously we're going to honor the intent and just realize that we may be dealing. In a number of instances, it would be ideal if there were a provider network established that had outlets, if you will, in those multiple venues. Having had some experience in my prior life in Idaho, where the organization I was associated with attempted to set up those multiple venues in rural communities. It made it very easy if someone wanted to serve those communities. They just came to my organization, and we helped them get that done. In our experience thus far in rural contracting, that hasn't always been the case. So I hear what the committee is telling us today. We will proceed to respond to this and just work work with due diligence to work through the contracting as timely as possible.
Mr. Chairman, I think what Ms. Vandenberg is telling me is that my two desires of having broad scope and quick implementation may be mutually exclusive. And putting the reminder back to us that this may slow the process down if they've got to contract in a multiple number of ways. But at least from my perspective, I would put the priority on doing it right, which is to take care of every veteran, regardless of where they live, not within a particular community, as compared to the speed of its accomplishment. We want both. But again, I think we'd make a terrible mistake if we go through this pilot program and we only, in a sense, take the easy areas within a rural VISN, in which it's easier to find a provider, or there's a multiple number of providers, or there's a larger number of veterans. We're still isolating that veteran who lives a long distance from a VA hospital. And so my priority would again be back to making sure that we implement this in a way that we can demonstrate it can be done VISN-wide. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Holverson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while we've been discussing all this, there's probably many veterans who haven't been able to find a way to get taken care of. So while we're trying to figure out how to do this, our veterans still need help. So instead of reinventing the wheel or trying to figure out what's rural, what's hardship, why aren't we just taking care of our veterans and letting them go wherever it is that they need to be taken care of? Now, I may be naive, and I am new. This is my first term. But while we're trying to figure out the intent of a law or how to do it the right way, no matter if it takes long, what are we doing right now for our rural veterans? Where are they going and how are they getting taken care of?
Thank you for the question. I'm glad you asked it because I can speak very directly to it. We are already providing a significant amount of fee care to rural and highly rural veterans. And under the aegis of the Office of Rural Health, in fiscal year 10, we have just put out $200 million to the VISNs to afford them the extra resource to provide fee care to rural and highly rural veterans. So I think it's important to note that that is a mechanism that is already in place. And what I understood the intent of this law to do was to give VA additional incentive and capacity to further contract out care to extend that access even more. But to answer your question, we are already meeting the needs of rural and highly rural veterans through the fee care mechanism.
So then, and not to interrupt, but so then what's the estimate of how many extra veterans are we going to take care of and the cost? So we're already spending money, we're already taking care of people. So this program, what are we assessing the pilot program's cost, the quality, and how many veterans are going to be eligible for the pilot program?
Let me take the assessment of cost.
Okay.
First, in our initial analysis of the implementation of the pilot as we previously understood it, we estimated up to $100 million. However, we knew that that was putting significant emphasis on primary care service delivery. And as you add in the multi-specialty dimensions of a patient's care, that cost could rise. So our current working assumption is that the pilot project, as we previously conceived it, would cost at least $100 million. And your second question about quality, that's part of the analysis and the process of contracting. And we're using all of the resources of VHA that we currently employ in the contracting process, pulling those in to look at the specifics of assessing the quality of the care and the patient's satisfaction with the care.
So for $100 million, we're going to help more people.
Yes, ma'am.
And better.
I think I would just observe that we believe that the standard of care, the quality of care that is evident in our current fee relationships is of a high quality nature. So when we say better, that could connote that there is something lacking in our current
Correct.
approach.
That's not a
But-
good word.
but
Better is not a good word.
I just want to be precise. We definitely are trying to enhance access. And by spreading the network of contract relationships further into highly rural communities and attempting to structure those relationships where in some instances they don't exist today, that will definitely enhance the quality of veterans care because of the
Okay,
elimination.
I just hope we're not reinventing the wheel. It
No.
looks like you've taken all this time to discuss hardship in rural when we should be taking this time to help our veterans with their health care. And now, with 1963, I believe, we take hardship out altogether. We should have no problem now implementing this bill. So, I know my time is about up, but I'm concerned about the care of my veterans, not debating whether they're rural or if they have a hardship. We are talking about people that we just want to take care of.
I understand
So
that,
thank
and
you.
I'm committed to that same mission.
Thank you.
Mr. Bozeman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we appreciate Ms. Vandenberg being here, and I really have enjoyed the discussion. It's been very helpful. What I'd like to do is go ahead and yield my time to Mr. Moran in the sense that, he's so knowledgeable about the issue, and again, we're getting some good testimony.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I've actually exceeded my time previously, but I appreciate Mr. Bozeman yielding. Just a couple of more thoughts. One, we've always had contention, it seems to me, in regard to pharmaceuticals, the ability for a local pharmacist to prescribe medication to a veteran. And we've pursued this issue before. There's been a number of bills introduced that would allow or require the VA to allow for a local physician to have a prescription honored by the VA. Is there any discussion, any policy work in place in regard to how we're going to handle the prescription drug issue and the local pharmacy?
I will ask Ms. Uppel to respond to that in terms of the work that the implementation team has done thus far.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir, for the question. That is something that the implementation plan working group really did spend a lot of time on. In fact, we've engaged very closely with our pharmacy colleagues on this issue. So we've come up with a number of recommendations on how we would address this, ranging from potential retail pharmacy network access and a number of other things. So if it's okay, we would certainly welcome the opportunity to keep the committee apprised of this issue, but that's certainly a major issue that we are very cognizant of and intend to work very closely on.
Very good. It will be somewhat self-defeating if we are able to go to our local doctor and get a prescription, but then can't go to our hometown pharmacist and have it filled.
Yes, exactly.
And then I'm on the Project Hero. It is implemented VISN-wide. Are there some analogies there that we can draw as to how this implementation may or should work?
I think there are, and we have spent an extensive amount of time with the lead staff, and we actually have an agreement with the business office staff that are the support to Project Hero. We've struck service level agreement to make it very clear that we want to leverage their experience and their expertise so that we don't reinvent the wheel.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Again, I would reiterate that I have a strong sense that the VA is serious about implementing this program in a way that is advantageous to veterans, and very much appreciate the working relationship that we've had on this legislation. And the concerns I've raised today are not critical of the VA, but just an attempt to make certain that our intentions are fulfilled in the VA's efforts to implement this bill. And so I thank you for the dialogue, and I look forward to our continued working relationship. I thank the chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Perriello?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership, Mr. Morans and others on this. It's of tremendous interest to the veterans in Central and Southern Virginia, rural care. We have great primary care providers, to Mr. Brown's point, who are ready and eager to participate in the program, many of whom are veterans themselves. So there's a lot of interest through various clinics and primary care centers there. And I really want to thank you for your work on moving forward with implementation on this and coming up with the criteria. And I do want to reiterate Mr. Moran's concerns and Mr. Michaud's concerns about the VISN-wide issue. But to disagree a little bit with Ms. Halverson, I think obviously the goal here is to get care as quickly as possible. But I think there's a genuine disagreement here where many of us on the committee feel like this is going to provide better care at a cheaper price. There are those who disagree with that and believe that getting people through the existing VA facilities is going to be better care at a quality price. So I think as we pick the data points here, the important thing is that we're picking enough and a varied enough set to be able to answer that question, which is how are we doing with this? Are we getting higher quality or equivalent quality care at a cheaper price? So as we choose these facilities, I know there are a lot of concerns, and you've put a lot of work into the criteria. But part of the point of a pilot project is to be able to say at the end, with some degree of certainty, yes, this system is working, and therefore not only do we want to go VISN-wide, but really nationwide with it, if it is, as I think many of us believe, going to be a better product. And again, we have that's a place where good people can disagree in advance, but hopefully we will produce the evidence through this and look at that. With that in mind, just very quickly, what is the timeline for making some of the decisions moving forward of where you see these pilots going forward?
As I indicated earlier, we envisioned being able to move to the contracting phase and after the selection and potentially have the pilots up by the end of this calendar year or early 2011. In light of the conversation that we've had here today, we're obviously going to go back and apprise the Undersecretary for Health of the need for us to think more broadly and make whatever adjustments are necessary then in the next steps of the process. But I would not envision us lagging dramatically. We're eager, we're on a marathon at this stage of the game, and we see that line where we're going to cross over from implementation planning to actually doing. So we're going to press on with all due diligence to keep this moving as fast as we can.
And again, we have throughout Vision 6 a lot of interest: Virginia, North Carolina, West Virginia. I happen to know Central and Southern Virginia the best, and there's some docs and vet organizations there very interested in this. Would it be possible to facilitate a meeting between folks in your office and them just to keep them apprised and letting them know about this as it develops?
Absolutely, yes. And I'm familiar with some of that interest by virtue of the roundtable conversation. So I fully appreciate that there are members of the provider community who are eager to move on this.
Well, thanks. And again, I just want to thank the members of this committee and yourself for moving this forward. I really do believe in this project in a big way. And if we implement it well, I think we're going to see good results. So thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Perriello. I have a few questions, and if others have additional questions, we'll go around again. And I know, Mr. Vandenberg, it was before you were in this position, but my concern is, I think all too often, sometimes when Congress passes legislation that's very well intended, we tend to not be so prescriptive to give the agencies the flexibility to make adjustments as they see fit. But the concern being sometimes if we're not prescriptive, then they tend to implement the way that they want to implement it, and that's a concern, especially ever since I've been on this committee in 2003. We've heard a lot from colleagues from all around the country about issues affecting veterans that live in rural areas. We've constantly had bills before our committee that would actually encourage the VA or mandate the VA actually contract out. And I know that the VA has always looked at, they do provide good service, and in areas where they should contract out is great, but you don't want to have VA to be more or less like the insurance agency where they're contracting everything out, and I can understand that. But in order to prevent that from happening, those of us who live in rural areas, we want to see results. And the concern that I have is, and I know it was before your time, is the fact that this legislation passed in October of 2008. We did not hear back from the VA until March of 2009 of why they can't implement it. And the concern being is when we went through the hearing process, the markup process, that was the time that the VA should have been before us saying, well, we need these changes. They were not, and we did not hear it until after the fact, which is a concern that I have, making sure that we want to be cognizant of the problems that VA has, but we can't do it unless you're at the table. And the time to have been at the table was during the hearing process, during the markup process, not after the fact. Because I can assure you that members of this committee, whether it's this Congress or next Congress or 10 Congresses down the road, rural health care issues for veterans will continue to be a problem and a concern. So the other issue that I want to you mentioned that you've asked the different VISN to report back the areas within their VISN that they'd like to have a pilot program, and as you heard, the intention was for it to be VISN-wide, and I do not believe that that's a problem since we've dealt with the Project Hero. I think there's a lot of similarities between Project Hero and what Mr. Moran was suggesting when he originally put forward this legislation. So my question being is, when this program gets moving VISN-wide, one of the concerns I would have is if central office does not intend to give VISN additional resources to implement it. The concern being is, and I've heard it at mini-MAC meetings in Maine, where when you do fee for service, with the increase in mileage reimbursement, that actually puts a lot more stress on the medical facility within that VISN, and therefore the central office is requiring that medical facility to meet their budget requirement, and hence they might have to actually stop fee for service. They might have to not fill a position that they need to be, a position that needs to be filled to meet the budgetary constraints. Do you envision that once this program is fully operating, well, during that process, that you would need to give the different VISNs additional resources to meet the pilot program? And if so, how much flexibility do you intend to give the different VISNs?
I can answer that. I am responsible as the acting director of the Office of Rural Health for the $250 million appropriation. And so in looking out to fiscal 11, we expected, as I mentioned earlier, to spend at least $100 million on this pilot. So now that we are going to go back and reset our parameters, we may need to amend that estimate. My understanding with the Undersecretary of Health is that this will be, in essence, the top line in the Office of Rural Health. And so looking at a $250 million appropriation, if this is the top line, then we are committed to providing those resources through the conduit of the Office of Rural Health for the duration of the pilot project. And then the implications of that are that other efforts that we might have considered pursuing through the Office of Rural Health might need to be reevaluated in light of that. So it's my current understanding, given the policy discussion that we've had within VHA, that this is our top line.
And how are you going to go about implementing this? Here's another concern that I've had, actually, receiving information from VSOs at the mini-MAC meeting in Maine is, for instance, and I've heard it elsewhere around the country, that for veterans who live in the real rural parts, I'll use Maine as an example, in northern Maine, if they have to go to Boston to access health care, they travel to Togus, stay overnight at Togus, go to Boston, do their operation in Boston, come back, stay overnight in Togus, then go back home. It's a 4-day affair, which is unfortunate. There has been a situation where actually a huge medical facility, actually in the city of Augusta, not too far from Togus, that was willing to build a whole wing just for veterans if VA would be willing to utilize that wing, knowing that VA is not going to build a brand new facility at Togus. From what I've been told from some of the VSOs is the medical facility was amendable to actually looking at that. However, the Vision office said no. So I can envision as you move forward in this pilot program where you might have a medical facility in a real rural area might have a different idea of how to move forward with this pilot program. However, there being constraints at the Vision office to not do it that way. So how is the Office of Rural Health or the Undersecretary going to make sure that this pilot program is a good pilot program and that there are not restraints putting on to the different medical facilities who might have a different idea than what the Vision office, in my case, Boston, might consider might be doable?
I think your question illustrates a very fundamental dynamic in the Veterans Health Administration today between the VISNs and the authority that they have to implement a plan using the resources that are provided to them for the population within the VISN, and the role that my Office of Policy and Planning plays, and in this instance, the Office of Rural Health in particular. So as we look, from my office, look out across the system and look at some of the gaps in service delivery, we are in a dialogue with the VISNs about how are they addressing those gaps and deploying resources. And that balance of influence then between the VISN's authority to proceed along the lines that they lay out and the Office of Policy and Planning observing certain patterns and potential emerging needs is a constant dynamic back and forth. And so I can just speak from the vantage point of the Office of Rural Health and this pilot in particular that my sense is that when you have a pilot and you're gathering this data during the course of the pilot, you come to various milestones where you can say that it's clear that there's higher veteran satisfaction, comparable, at a minimum, comparable quality, and this is what the cost looks like. And in instances where veterans are having to travel those long distances and there might be an alternative provider mechanism available, it would be the Office of Rural Health talking to that VISN and saying, let's talk about this make-buy. Let's look at this more carefully because here's a population that has this need and we've demonstrated a way to address that need. So that's, from my vantage point, the conversation that I've already had with some of our VISN directors and will continue to have in terms of striking a balance between the authority that they have and the responsibility that I have in my office to observe and question.
Ms. Moran, do you have any?
Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. Just one additional inquiry about CBOCs. Has the department taken into account in its CBOC planning the consequences or effects of this legislation, or does that follow after we get the pilot in place? Would we expect a different alignment of CBOCs, less necessity?
If I could explain what our current process is with regard to CBOCs, several years ago, in light of some of the dynamic that the chairman just illustrated, my office was empowered to be responsible for the analysis of the gaps. And so what we do each year now prospectively is work with the VISNs to point out areas that appear to be underserved. And then they have to come in with a submission that responds to that. So to answer your question specifically, the further placement of CBOCs was not something that we were juxtapositioning with vis-a-vis this pilot. However, that process of looking for gaps, underserved areas, and the population at risk is very integral to the work that's going on in the Office of Policy and Planning routinely. And so we have the capacity to take this pilot and the implications of this pilot into consideration. I'd also observe that a decision was recently made to help to underwrite the cost of 51 CBOCs that had been previously approved that will serve rural veterans through the Office of Rural Health. And so by virtue of us funding those CBOCs, I have a new window into the VISNs and how those CBOCs will perform. And so that gives the Office of Rural Health a new opportunity for dialogue with my VISN colleagues regarding how we are meeting the needs of rural and highly rural veterans. Does that respond to your question, sir?
Yes, ma'am, it does. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rodriguez?
Yeah, let me follow up on, because I know as we reach out, at least in my community, I know it was done with private providers. Do we have any contracts right now? I know in the past we have with community health centers.
Sir, I'd have to take that question for the record. I do not have that data at hand.
Because I would think that based on, and although I've gotten indications that the reimbursements were not appropriate when they did have it with the VA, but I'm wondering as to why, because I know they they get the reimbursements on Medicare, Medicaid, and all the others, and I gather we collect that, right? Is that correct? Does the VA get reimbursed also from, or just from the private sector?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Does the VA get reimbursed
From Medicare, Medicaid on the veterans?
No, sir.
No,
we
okay.
take
just get
private
sector?
insurance coverage,
Private insurance.
but not Medicare and Medicaid coverage.
Can you look to see in terms of if you have any contracts now with community health
Yes, sir.
centers, since they're reimbursed also from federal side, and especially from the community mental health centers that might be out there in terms of, because I know they do have a good number of providers that in some cases there's a great need for them. And let me and as you look at continuing to move in that direction, we're optimistic that at some point we'll have 94 to 97% of the people insured in the future. Right now, I know in my community, 1 out of 3 is not insured. In terms of the implications of that, as it deals with the cost, as another factor.
We have begun the analysis within the department to understand the implications of healthcare reform and broader health insurance accessibility to the entire population, including veterans who are not currently enrolled with VA. And so that analysis is underway, and we are eagerly awaiting some further clarification as to the language in the law pertaining to the tax credits that an individual would be able to access for coverage vis-a-vis a veteran's eligibility or current enrollment with VA.
Okay, and I would, if you can get back with me, or my staff in reference to possible contracts with community health centers
Yes, sir,
through our community, and seeing what kind of arrangements we might be able to make, since they also get federal resources.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
The last question I have is, what steps will be taken to foster an efficient but secure flow of patient medical information between VA and participating providers? And I assume that probably might be some analogies that could be made with Project Hero in that regard.
Yes, sir. Basically, our answer at this point is that we are working within the parameters that VA IT has given us regarding the transfer of information. There are mechanisms available for read-only interface. At this point, there isn't a clear signal that we will be able to transmit information and receive information very easily. But we're certainly going to take full advantage of the mechanisms that have been put in place vis-a-vis Project Hero in this pilot.
And do you have any concerns with the IT? Because I've heard some concerns when we originally separated them from the medical facility that they might not be on the same page as the medical facility and IT. So you said you have to live within the parameters of what they have set. Are those parameters too restrictive, or should they be changed in any way?
Well, what I meant to say by that is that there are rules that govern interoperability, and those rules are determined not only by VA policy, but also by broader considerations of requirements for privacy, for example. And so we're operating within those parameters. The larger IT question, I will defer to the Undersecretary for Health. There is an ongoing dialogue within the department about the balance of the multiple strategic issues facing the department and the IT support that's required to achieve the Secretary's vision of a transformed VA.
Any other questions from? Well, I want to thank you, Ms. Vandenberg, for coming today. It's been really helpful, and look forward to working with you as we move forward to implement this program in a way that it was intended to be implemented. And if there are any problems as we move forward for full implementation, appreciate it if you could let the committee know what those concerns are, and look forward to working with you. So once again, thank you very much for all your hard work and dedication to take care of our veterans.
I'm a nurse. I'm sure you've all heard the adage, once a nurse, always a nurse.
Yeah.
And I'm very far removed from the bedside, but not far removed from the commitment to reaching out every day in some way to assure that our veterans receive the appropriate care that they have earned and that they deserve. So
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much. No other questions. This hearing's closed.